It appeared to be nothing more than a portrait of a mother and her daughters, but a closer look revealed something unusual about their hands. Dr. James Mitchell had spent 15 years studying photographic archives at the New York Historical Society. Yet, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The portrait had arrived in a donation box from a Brooklyn estate sale, alongside dozens of glass plate negatives wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated 1923. Most depicted familiar late 19th century scenes: stern-faced merchants, wedding parties, children dressed in their Sunday best. One image, however, stopped him cold. 3 women gazed out across time. A mother, likely around 40, sat centered in an ornate wooden chair. Her daughters, who seemed to be in their late teens or early 20s, stood on either side of her. All 3 were African American, dressed in their finest clothing, high-colored dresses adorned with intricate lace, their hair styled with deliberate care. Behind them was a painted garden backdrop typical of studio portraits from the era. What caught James's attention was not the composition or the dignity of their expressions. It was their hands. The mother's hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced in an unusual pattern. Her right thumb crossed over her left, while her index and middle fingers extended outward and the remaining fingers curled inward. Each daughter placed one hand on her mother's shoulders, their fingers arranged in similarly deliberate configurations. James had examined thousands of Victorian-era portraits. Subjects usually kept their hands still, folded naturally, or resting on props. Photographers of the time demanded absolute stillness during long exposures. Every detail mattered. These hand positions were too precise, too intentional to be accidental. He raised a magnifying glass and studied the negative more closely. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, someone had etched tiny numbers into the glass. NY892247. The image stayed with him. That evening, back in his Upper West Side apartment, James spread his research materials across the dining table. He had photographed the glass negative with a high-resolution camera, and now the portrait filled his laptop screen with startling clarity. The detail was remarkable for an image from 1892. He could see the texture of the fabric, the small brooch pinned to the mother's collar, even subtle differences in the daughter's features. Still, it was the hands that held his attention. He zoomed in until each finger filled the frame. The positioning was unmistakable. This was not random. The mother's right thumb crossed deliberately over her left, a gesture that required conscious effort to hold during the exposure. Her extended fingers formed a specific shape. The daughter's hands on her shoulders echoed variations of the same pattern. Fingers bent at exact angles, thumbs placed with clear intention. James had studied Civil War photography, Reconstruction-era documentation, and early 20th century social reform movements. He knew activists and underground networks often relied on visual signal-specific poses, carefully placed objects, even subtle stanzas to convey hidden meanings to those who knew how to read them. He opened his database on abolitionist and post-emancipation activist networks. The Underground Railroad had used quilts, songs, and symbols. But this was 1892, nearly 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 15 years after Reconstruction ended. What networks still required secret codes? His phone buzzed. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in African American history, replied to his earlier message. Free tomorrow morning. What did you find? James typed back. Something that might rewrite what we know about post-Reconstruction activism in New York. Bring your sources on property rights and documentation struggles. Sarah arrived at the Historical Society at 9 sharp, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with research materials. James had projected the portrait onto the wall of the research room, larger than life. The 3 women looked down at them with quiet dignity. Look at their hands, James said, gesturing with a laser pointer. Every finger was positioned deliberately. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. She set her bag down and pulled out a thick folder. After Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, African American families in the North faced a different kind of struggle. Not slavery, but systematic exclusion. Property rights, inheritance, even proof of identity became tools used against them. She spread documents across the table: legal papers, city records, newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s. New York was not the progressive refuge people imagined. Black families fought to retain property, establish businesses, and prove legal marriages. Many had fled the South with nothing but their word. No birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no documentation. James picked up a yellowed newspaper from 1891. The headline read, "Property Dispute in Harlem. Family claims ownership without documentation." Exactly, Sarah said. I've been researching mutual aid societies from this period. African American communities built networks to help one another navigate these systems. They pooled resources to hire lawyers, shared information about sympathetic officials, and created their own verification systems when official ones excluded them. Secret networks, James said quietly. Not secret in the sense of hidden, Sarah replied. Secret in the sense of parallel-operating alongside official systems using methods white authorities either didn't notice or didn't understand. James turned back to the portrait. What if this wasn't just a family photograph? What if it was documentation? The etched numbers in the corner NYU, 8922247, became the breakthrough. After 2 days combing through city directories and business records, James found a reference. Studio 247 belonged to a photographer named Thomas Wright, who operated from a building on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896. The address still existed. Though the building had long since been converted into apartments, James stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the brick facade, imagining how it once looked. Wright's studio would have occupied the second floor, with large north-facing windows designed to capture the soft, even light preferred for portrait photography. Further research into Wright revealed something unexpected. Thomas Wright was white, born in Massachusetts in 1851, trained as a photographer in Boston. He moved to New York in 1887 and opened his studio in a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly diverse. Irish immigrants, Italian families, and a growing African-American community migrating from the South filled the neighborhood. Wright's clientele, however, was unusual for the time. While many white photographers either refused to photograph black clients or charged them far higher rates, Wright advertised in African-American newspapers and welcomed all customers at equal prices. Sarah uncovered an interview Wright gave to a small progressive newspaper in 1894. In it, he described photography as a tool of dignity in documentation, insisting that everyone deserved a quality portrait regardless of background. Reading between the lines, James sensed something deeper, a quiet form of activism, a deliberate decision to serve a community others excluded. He was an ally, Sarah said, glancing over James's shoulder, and if these hand positions are codes, he would have helped create them, document them, and distribute them. James contacted Dr. Marcus Thompson, a cryptography historian at Columbia University who specialized in visual communication systems. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society that afternoon, his curiosity sparked by James's cryptic phone call. Victorian-era codes often seem impossibly complex to us now, Marcus said as he studied the portrait, but they were usually practical for the people who used them. The key is understanding the context, who needed to communicate, what they needed to convey, and who they needed to hide it from. He photographed the hand positions from multiple angles, then opened his laptop and began creating digital tracings. Let's assume each hand position represents something specific, not letters. Letters would be too complex for a photograph. More likely categories, confirmations, statuses. Sarah pulled out her research on documentation struggles. What if it's about identity verification? These networks needed ways to confirm who people were, that they were legitimate members of the community and could be trusted with sensitive information. Marcus nodded slowly. That makes sense. The mother's hand position could indicate her role, head of the family, network member, someone vouching for others. The daughter's positions could reflect their status, documented, or seeking assistance. They spent the afternoon comparing the portrait to other photographs James had recovered from the estate sale box. 3 additional images showed similar hand positioning, always subtle, always intentional. In one, a couple's intertwined fingers formed a distinct pattern. In another, a man's hand rested on a Bible, with specific fingers extended. It's not a single code, Marcus said at last. It's a system, multiple signals combined to convey different meanings. Someone trained these families how to pose, someone photographed them deliberately, and others in the network knew how to read the images. Sarah then made the connection that unraveled everything. While researching property rights cases in New York courts from the 1890s, she noticed a pattern. Dozens of African-American families had successfully defended property claims, secured identity documents, or proven legal marriages, often represented by the same lawyer. His name appeared repeatedly: Robert Hayes. Hayes maintained an office on West 34th Street. Court records showed he won an unusually high number of cases for black clients during a period when such victories were rare. More telling, he frequently submitted photographic evidence, family portraits, images demonstrating respectability and community standing. He was using Wright's photographs in court, James realized, not just as proof of identity, but as verification of community status. These families were photographed, their images cataloged, and when documentation was needed, Hayes could present the portraits to judges. But there was more. In Hayes's archived case files at the New York Public Library, Sarah discovered letters, correspondence between Hayes and other activists, teachers, ministers, and business owners discussing verification protocols and community documentation systems. One letter dated March 1893 was especially revealing. Hayes wrote to a Brooklyn minister, "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families. Mr. Wright continues to provide his services at minimal cost. The hand positioning system allows us to encode essential information that can be verified later. Each portrait serves as both dignified representation and practical identification." James leaned back, stunned. They had created an entire parallel documentation system. When official channels failed these families, they built their own. Sarah said, and they hid it in plain sight. The portraits appeared to be ordinary family photographs. A casual viewer would notice nothing unusual, but to those who understood the code, each image carried vital information. With the network structure becoming clear, James grew determined to identify the three women in the original portrait. The estate sale had come from a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with deep African-American roots. Donor records at the Historical Society listed the seller as Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the property from her grandmother. James called Patricia that evening. She was 72, sharp-voiced and initially wary of his interest in old family photographs. When he described the portrait in detail, her tone shifted. "My great-grandmother," she said softly. "That's Eleanor. Eleanor Morrison. The daughters would be my grandmother Ruth and her sister Grace. Can you tell me about them?" James asked. Patricia paused. Eleanor was born enslaved in Virginia. She came north after the war with Ruth, who was still a baby. Grace was born here in New York. Eleanor worked as a seamstress. She was known for her lace and fine embroidery. That's how she supported the family. Did she ever mention being part of any organizations or community groups? She was active in her church, Patricia said, and she helped people. That's what my grandmother always said. Eleanor helped families with paperwork, finding housing, connecting with lawyers. She knew everyone. She knew how to navigate every system. James felt his pulse quicken. "Patricia, I believe your great-grandmother was part of something important, a network that helped African-American families document their identities and protect their rights after Reconstruction." Patricia fell silent again. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion. "I always knew she was special, but so much history was lost. After she died in 1919, the family scattered. My grandmother rarely spoke about those early years." With Patricia's permission, James and Sarah began tracing Eleanor Morrison's connections. Church records from Bethel Church in Brooklyn listed Eleanor as a member from 1879 until her death. She served on the Ladies' Aid Society, which officially provided charity to families in need. The meeting minutes, however, revealed something far more structured. The society kept meticulous records of the families they assisted, names, ages, circumstances, needs, but some entries included notations that made little sense on their own. Numbers and letter codes that appeared arbitrary until Sarah realized they matched Thomas Wright's numbering system. "They're cross-referencing," Sarah explained. The church society identified families who needed documentation. Wright photographed them using the appropriate hand codes. Hayes then used the photographs in legal proceedings. The church records tracked everything, hidden in plain sight within routine charity documentation. James uncovered more photographs in Wright's archive. The Historical Society had acquired Wright's entire collection in 1923 after his death, but it had never been properly cataloged. Dozens of portraits displayed the same hand positioning to families, photographed between 1890 and 1896. Each image was carefully numbered, each one documenting people systematically, excluded from official records. They began identifying other members of the network. A teacher named Samuel Brooks helped families obtain school records for their children. A clerk in the city property office, Mary Chen, processed deeds and ensured paperwork was properly filed. A minister, Reverend James Washington, performed marriages and provided certificates when official channels refused. Each person had taken quiet risks, using their position to help, working within systems designed to exclude the very people they served. Together, they had created something powerful, a shadow archive that preserved dignity and protection when official. America offered neither. 3 months into their research, James and Sarah organized an exhibition at the Historical Society. They displayed 20 portraits from Wright's collection, each showing the hand positioning system and accompanied by the story they had uncovered about the family depicted. Patricia Johnson attended, seeing her great-grandmother's portrait properly honored for the first time. She brought her daughter and granddaughter, 4 generations of Eleanor Morrison's descendants, standing before the image that had started everything. The exhibition's most powerful moments came when other descendants arrived. James and Sarah had located families connected to 12 of the photographed individuals. Each brought fragments of the story, oral histories, old letters, faded documents that suddenly made sense within the context of the network. An elderly man named Thomas Hayes stood before a portrait of his great-grandfather. The lawyer, Robert Hayes, photographed with his hands arranged in the same deliberate code. "I always heard he helped people," Thomas said quietly, "but I never knew the extent. I never knew he was part of something this organized." A woman named Grace Brooks studied a portrait of Samuel Brooks, the teacher. "My family said he was arrested once in 1895 for helping a family obtain false documents, but the charges were dropped. Looking at this now, I don't think the documents were false. I think he was helping people get the documentation they deserved but were denied." The New York Times covered the exhibition. The article ran under the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network." Within days, historians from across the country contacted James, sharing similar discoveries from their own region's parallel networks in Philadelphia. Boston, and Chicago, all operating during the same period, all using subtle codes and photographs to document and protect African American families navigating hostile systems. 6 months after first discovering the portrait, James stood in the Historical Society's conservation lab. Carefully handling the glass plate negative, dozens of Wright's photographs had been digitally restored, each image now preserved and accessible to descendants and researchers. The portrait of the mother and her daughters had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, displayed in museums. For James, its significance remained deeply personal. He thought of Eleanor Morrison, born enslaved, who had built a life of dignity and purpose in New York. She had helped countless families navigate systems designed to exclude them and had posed for this photograph with her daughters, their hands carefully arranged in a code that would preserve their place in history. Patricia Johnson later donated Eleanor's personal papers to the Historical Society, a diary, and business records from her work as a seamstress. In the diary, Eleanor wrote about the photograph. Had our portrait made today. Mr. Wright is a kind man and understands what we are building. The girls were nervous, but I told them this picture will matter. Someday people will see what we did here. She had been right. The photograph had mattered. It preserved not only their likenesses, but evidence of their resistance, their ingenuity, and their refusal to be erased. Sarah ultimately traced 63 families through the network, documenting how they obtained property deeds, legal marriages, business licenses, and school records, fundamental rights that should have been automatic, but instead required elaborate workarounds to achieve. The network had operated roughly between 1888 and 1897, assisting hundreds of families before slowly fading as some activists passed away, others relocated, and new systems took shape. Thomas Wright died in 1923, his role largely forgotten. Robert Hayes continued practicing law until 1910. Eleanor Morrison lived long enough to see her daughters married and settled, her work carried forward by others. The network did not eliminate systemic injustice, but it provided vital, practical support to people who desperately needed it. James now met regularly with descendants, gathering oral histories and reconnecting families who shared this concealed legacy. The portrait had become more than a historical artifact. It served as a bridge between generations, evidence that their ancestors had been resourceful, interconnected, and determined to pursue justice when official America denied it. James often thought of Eleanor's hands, deliberately arranged in that Brooklyn studio in 1892, her fingers forming a code that would survive her and carry her story across more than a century. In the end, the simplest gestures could contain the deepest truths. Sometimes, all it took was looking closely enough to see.